James Joyce's Finnegans Wake is perhaps the greatest achievement of aesthetic form ever produced. It addresses with moving complexity the relationship between the content of a work of art and the form used to express that content, acting as a living organism which probes its own functions. But instead of doing so in a hopelessly self-destructive manner, it does it in a way such that the wounds created by the prodding and poking form otherworldly flowers, growths, and novel appendages of meaning and evocation. Finnegans Wake takes advantage of the effects of perception with regards to the circular geometry of the idea of a circle. It's well known that Finnegans Wake starts in the middle of a sentence and ends in the middle of that same sentence, albeit at different parts of the same sentence. It opens indented with a lowercase r, river run past even Adams from swerve of shore to bend of bay, and it ends the. In the middle of a sentence, the. And you're like, what are you supposed to do? And you realize, okay, you have to go back to the beginning. And this has been something that has perplexed even someone who's picked up Finnegans Wake for a second and seen, well, it doesn't even start at the beginning of a sentence. It's already breaking linguistic conventions and whatnot. But this is actually something really fascinating because in many ways, Finnegans Wake has no story. In many ways, it goes nowhere. In the sense of, even formally, you come right back to where you started. You're almost told to reread the book as part of the book itself, without it having to tell you to read it. Its form itself leads to certain desires of what you want to do with the book. And the circle is a really key piece of geometric imagery in understanding the form of Finnegans Wake, and it's also evoked several times in the content of Finnegans Wake. And there are kind of two main ways in which the circle is alluded to. First is Giambattista Vico's conception of history being circular in his La Nueva Ciencia, or the New Science. And in the New Science, Vico says that history consists of three stages, that being the age of gods, of heroes, of the people, or democracy, and then there's a fourth short recurso, which is basically a rebirth cycle. It signals the cyclical nature of these cycles and shows the inevitable recurrence of these cycles, such that we'd evolve at the moment of democracy back into the chaos that is the primordial void that starts back up the cycle again. And this 3 plus an extra cycle, so these 4 cycles are alluded to throughout Finnegans Wake. For example, Finnegans Wake is 3 main large parts, and then a 4th short recurso, which is the Analibia Pluribel chapter, probably the most famous part of Finnegans Wake because of its relative simplicity and its beauty. It just evokes this luscious language that Joyce is so good at creating. In addition, you also have the title of Finnegans Wake itself is 4 syllables, and at that it's a 3-syllable word, Finnegans, and then wake, a 1-syllable word. So even in that way, it is alluding to Vico's philosophy of history in very interesting ways. And then second off, we have the image of the Ouroboros. This is the snake that is circled around eating its own tail. And this is an important piece of mythical imagery. It's used a lot, for example, in the Old Norse mythology, in the Eddas, in which you have the tree Yggdrasil, and it is being circumambulated by a snake eating its own tail, which in fact keeps this system together. On top of the Ouroboros, you have four dwarves, which represent the four cardinal directions, holding up a globe, which is a dead giant's skull, which is the sky, which is like the equivalent of the firmament in kind of Christian mythos. And the snake is the reason that all of this hangs together, that the skies don't fall down on top of us. And in fact, Thor often wants to defeat this serpent, but if he does, the world will end. So we have, in the Eddas, this is representing infinity, it's representing time, it's representing the natural balancing capacities of nature, and thus this cycle of good and evil, because this snake is also the cause of a lot of problems. So of course the snake has a lot of mythical imagery that gets put into this circular geometric pattern in order to represent the Ouroboros. And in addition to the Ouroboros being in the Eddas, it's also in the works of Friedrich Nietzsche. He uses it, for example, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in which the Ouroboros represents the eternal return of the same, or the eternal recurrence of the self-same. It symbolizes kind of a paradoxical situation. You could interpret it as literally everything repeats identically, as in there is nothing new under the sun, as Ecclesiastes put it. But I think a better and more nuanced interpretation is the one that Deleuze gives of Nietzsche, where he says that this is the multiplicity inherent in being itself. That being itself is a constant unfolding of itself cyclically, coming out of itself, augmenting itself, and there's this interplay between that which is and that which is changing and is to come and whatnot, and you have this sort of battle which really is kind of indicative of the way that Nietzsche saw things, for sure. And these different circles are really played upon in Finnegans Wake, because the real question is it a perfect circle, replicating its content perfectly and infinitely, as you could think of with the literal eternal recurrence of the same? Is Joyce literally just saying, look, this book goes back and forth and nothing changes? No. In fact, if you look at, for example, even the process of Joyce creating Finnegans Wake, he has this intensive revision process he goes through where he's constantly revising the text throughout the 16 or 17 years that it takes him to write this thing from 1922 to 1939. And throughout this, he's got this lively relationship going on, for example, with some critics that are providing some early literary criticism on what was at that time called work in progress, before the name Finnegans Wake was revealed. And they're writing various things about work in progress. And Joyce actually puts those criticisms into Finnegans Wake and kind of makes fun of his own critics. So there's this constant lively relationship to the artistic process, to the editorial process, to the hermeneutic process of kind of trying to find some meaning in this thing. It's a constant kind of process of mediation and arguing, really, in a sense. The text seems to be arguing with itself at times in really interesting ways. Even though Finnegans Wake starts and ends with two different parts of the same sentence, they're formally separated in the sense that they're at opposite ends of the book. In some ways, they're as far away as they can be. They're separated by 627 pages, right? Because it's 628 pages total. So it's basically as separate as it can be formally, and yet they indicate to each other. They speak across the largest expanse of this literary universe that is possible. And I think something interesting to note is that Joyce mentioned that when he was writing the end of Finnegans Wake, as Anna Livia Plurabelle is basically doing this soliloquy where she imagines basically evaporating, because she's the river Liffey, and now she's evaporating into the sky, and then she's soon to rain back down and start the Liffey over again. And there's this cyclical, the water cycle is cyclical, of course, and that's what Joyce is playing on here. And Joyce mentions that when he was writing the end of Finnegans Wake, he wanted the sentence to trail off a niente, into nothing. That's why he wanted it to end with the. Because you could say, for example, the, but we usually don't say the, we say the, right? Even the versus the. It's almost the least thing that you can do with your mouth. It's just this light final vibration as the evaporates into nothing. And as a result, there's a sense that maybe we need to take a pause, that we need to be comfortable with this silence, with this space that is in between every repetition. This irremediable difference that has to be kind of wrestled with. And we see this also indicated at the beginning of Finnegans Wake. Because as many critics have noted, Finnegans Wake opens with the first paragraph, which notably does not begin with a capital letter, indented. So there is once again stressed this notion of space. So many critics, I think, have rightly pointed out that there is supposed to be a sense of repose before restarting the cycle. A sense of pondering before things happen again. And it's almost as if Joyce is encouraging this momentary inward turn to think, to step back before doing things again. We've heard it said that history repeats itself, right? Or that history often rhymes, I think Mark Twain said. Joyce is saying that maybe we can do something about that if we sort of think about this, turn it into a critical hermeneutic project. Think about the fact, too, that the Ouroboros has space between its mouth and its tail. As it's going back around to eat its own tail, there is an irrevocable amount of space between those two articulated points of the body that are never fully brought together, because otherwise it would be this undifferentiated circle. You wouldn't be able to tell where the head is and where the tail is. But because they're separated, you can clearly see where the head is and where the tail is. And, in drawings of this, for example, it's not just a circle with a cut through it. They have artistically rendered it such that there is a head and there is a tail. And this brings us to the fact of what has been called the hermeneutic circle. Now, in hermeneutics, the study of interpretation and meaning, we have this thing called the hermeneutic circle, which is a way of talking about the fact that we always are presupposing information, frameworks of interpretation and of the creation of meaning that lie outside of what's in front of us. So, for example, when you pick up any book, let alone Finnegans Wake, you already have this tacitly understood knowledge of what words mean in such a way that you can never fully sort of get in front of and objectively determine meaning, because you're always immersed in it. You're always part of this unfolding process of meaning, which is always, in a sense, self-referential. And this is the reason why the hermeneutic circle has often been considered a problem. That, how are we supposed to do hermeneutics if we can never get outside of this void that is our presuppositions? But Heidegger very importantly notes in the introduction to Being in Time that this problem of the hermeneutic circle is not a problem because when you have, for example, this tacit understanding of various linguistic conventions, you don't know them in a formal way. You don't have all your knowledge of language as if they were grammatical rules that you could state syllogistically, that you could formally lay out, which is to say that you could give them a formal construction in some sort of concept. No, you just kind of tacitly know things. And Heidegger, furthermore, says that this is a valid form of knowledge. Just because it's not formal doesn't mean that it's not itself a valid form of knowing. Because, for example, you do in fact know how to speak English, even if you don't know all that knowledge formally, in terms of some representationalist understanding of concepts in your head. You're just immersed in this environment through which you're able to learn these different conventions. So really, for Heidegger, the hermeneutic circle is instead more of a hermeneutic spiral. Instead of something that just irrevocably gets stuck spinning its wheels, going round and round in a circle back to where it started, unable to penetrate any deeper. Instead, it's like a spiral that gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and approaches this infinitesimally small center, which is the thing that we're investigating when we're doing hermeneutics. We're slowly chipping away at this artifice that is the work of art, and we're trying to find some way by which we can come to some kernel of at least something that we can agree upon. And this is where someone like the pragmatists would conceptualize, for example, truth in a very similar way. People like John Dewey or William James are going to say that this is exactly how truth works. Through this process of investigating things and doing it in a way where it is mediated by a number of different people coming together and talking about these concepts. By doing so, just like in science, we're kind of slowly whittling things down, finding kind of the limits of our paradigms and whatnot. We're investigating what it means to know things and for things to be true, for example. And we can get to a situation where we can come ever and ever closer to more refined understandings of physics, for example. Anytime you have a scientific theory, in order for it to get superseded by a new one, that new one has to explain the phenomena that the previous theory did just as well, if not greater. It needs to have greater explanatory power. It needs to have greater predictive power. It needs to be at least as coherent, if not more coherent. And ideally, you'd want it to be concrete so that it's applicable, but that is sort of, this is the difference between a sort of practical-minded physicist and a purely theoretical physicist. But this is what we do. We sort of whittle down at things where we move through different paradigms for how we use language when we're talking about scientific phenomena, for example. But nevertheless, we are spiraling inwards. And notably, we will do this ad infinitum. We will grow ever and ever closer to orbiting around something, but we will always still be in this circular motion. Our circles will just be smaller. And one of the things that Heidegger noticed when he is examining the hermeneutic circle is the fact that a lot of the reason that people were trying to get out of the hermeneutic circle is so that they could find some ground for language, for meaning, for metaphysics, for truth, etc. They wanted to find some firm foundation, as Descartes would put it. Some firm foundation by which we can know things for 100% certainty a priori. But Heidegger said that there is no ground. That as we do this process of the unfolding of truth through hermeneutics, because for Heidegger, ontology is fundamentally a question of hermeneutics, of interpretation. When we do this, we see that we are orbiting around not a ground, a Grund, but a ungrund, an unground. A fundamental nothing kernel, which we use as something that we can orbit around, but we don't even need to get to it. It's just there to sort of act as, a centrifugal force that's keeping things in confluence, that's allowing things to continue to move, which, if you've heard the phrase, stasis is death, that's exactly what's going on here. If our hermeneutics is no longer spiraling, is no longer moving, that's the equivalent of death. And Heidegger, in fact, thinks that being itself is sort of doing this process of unfolding, of revealing itself, of articulating itself, and making itself reified through this self-recognition, through this self-penetration, which is exactly what Joyce is trying to do in Finnegans Wake. And one of the reasons that it's been said by Anthony Burgess that Finnegans Wake is as close to an artistic representation of nature that there has ever been. It is the closest to evoking nature through a work of art that there has ever been. And by getting rid of this transcendent core, accepting the ungrund, we do something really interesting. And this is one of the key paradoxes of Finnegans Wake. Our reading path is in many ways linear rather than circular. Think about this. As you're reading through a book, we travel sequentially, letter by letter, word by word, sentence by sentence, page by page, until we somehow end up right back where we started. And we're like, well, how did we get here? I've been going through all this stuff. I thought there was some progression happening, some unfolding happening. But in a sense, you were never conscious of any turning going on. We appear to have gone in a straight line, which at its terminus manages to fold onto its own starting point without ever having bent. So, in many ways, the Finnegans Wake reading experience is linear, and in this perfectly paradoxical way, somehow ends up referring to itself, unfolding itself through this act of self-interpretation. But in another way, the Finnegans Wake reading experience is not purely linear. Words will hearken across the text such that you'll have common motifs, even in just the sound of phrases, in such a way that you will have phrases hearkening across hundreds of pages of text instantly, leaping across, violating laws of, a maximum speed of movement. It is an instantaneous connection. Sometimes these connections are disparate and tenuous, but sometimes they're profoundly moving, such as, for example, the greatest one of all, the 627-page gap between the first sentence and the very same sentence which is iterated at the end of the work. So not only is Finnegans Wake both circular and straight, but with regards to this hermeneutic spiral of kind of going more and more inwards like this, not only are we going inwards, but we are also iterating the spiral downwards. So not only are we going like this, but we're going like this, going down in 3 dimensions instead of just 2. And this is really interesting. We're increasing our level of obscurity, of complexity, of emotional and psychological depth, such that oftentimes this brute scholarly examination and explication of various cross-linguistic meanings and intertextual allusions only muddles the originally only somewhat muddled meaning of a passage. And as a result, Finnegans Wake has this unique ability to violate the text's ability to promise its unfolding through hard work via successful investigation and interpretation. And yet, despite this increase in depth, which may seem to signal this terrifying nihilistic state of, oh, things are just getting more and more muddled, I can't handle it, I can't figure out what to do, nevertheless, we are encouraged to go beyond this nihilistic conclusion in the same way that Joyce and his intellectual forefather Nietzsche would say, that we should create and sing and dance, nevertheless, accept the vitality of the movement of this cycle, the way the forces are felt in the bends of each turn. As the text mounts successive assaults on our assumptions about language or culture or human action, amassing into an increasingly unsettling nuclear wart, it nevertheless retains that which is most beautiful and even expands upon its own inherent bodily beauty. It's a body affecting you, and you feel this sort of radiating pulse coming off of it. It seems to violate this law that that which is most beautiful is that which is beautiful. Instead, that which is a seemingly impenetrable lump of nonsense becomes the most evocatively beautiful artistic edifice. So that being said, I hope that this has helped make sense of the intricacies of circularity in the form of Finnegans Wake. Feel free to check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks available if you'd like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and as a poor college student, I'd appreciate anything you have to give, but no pressure. That being said, that's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.